Now what about Islam? Remember, these are two separate things. Now Islam does deny those things. Islam does deny Jesus died on the cross, yet it's the most historically responsible conclusion. Islam does deny the deity of Jesus Christ, but once again, it's the most historically responsible conclusion. So already, before getting off the ground, when we take a look at Islam, which comes 600 years after Jesus, 600 miles away from Jesus, what it says about Jesus is not historically sound. Could it still be true? Of course, it could still be true, but we'd have to throw out history in order for it to be true. And if we're willing to throw out the evidence, then anything could be true. But let's take a look at the claims of Islam. Remember, La ilaha illallah Muhammad Rasulullah, our claim for Islam is Allah, the God of this universe, as found in the Qur'an. And we have good reason to believe the Qur'an is the inspired word of God. Number two, Muhammad, is he a prophet of God or not? If I can show either of these things to be true, then I have a good reason to believe in Islam. So what does the evidence say? Let's first take a look at Muhammad's life. The first story, and I'm going to try to be as objective as possible. Please forgive me, I am just human, and I'll probably introduce some biases into what I'm saying, but I'm trying to be as objective as possible. An element of grace would be appreciated. The earliest source on Muhammad's life is Ibn Ishaq's Sirat Rasulullah. Okay, Ibn Ishaq, Sirat Rasulullah. Ibn Ishaq wrote somewhere around 150 years after Muhammad died. So, already, we should keep in mind that John's Gospel came about 65 to 70 years after Jesus, and scholars were throwing it out. This is twice as late. And when it comes to reliability, I would put that on a logarithmic scale. I wouldn't put it on a linear scale. This is exponentially less reliable than John's Gospel, but let's just put that aside for just one moment. That's my conclusion now, in the 21st century. But what did the people at that time say? Let me clarify for you. We don't actually have Ibn Ishaq's Sirat Rasulullah. What we have is a recension by a man named Ibn Hisham. So Ibn Hisham saved Ibn Ishaq's Sirat Rasulullah. Ibn Ishaq's Sirat Rasulullah has been lost to history. A man named Ibn Hisham saved it. And here is what Ibn Hisham says. He says, I found in Ibn Ishaq's work things that were so offensive, so impossible, that I have taken them out. What is left is those things that I have found true. So what is Ibn Hisham saying about Ibn Ishaq's Sirat Rasulullah? He's saying that it is not reliable, at least in the form in which it's found, and he has had to alter it. So what we have, the earliest source that we have on Muhammad's life, 150 years after Muhammad has died, and not exactly from then, a little bit later, but let's just say it is that, is an altered version of a source that Muslims at the time, Muslim scholars at the time, found untrustworthy in parts. That's what we have to start with. Okay, so this is before we've even gotten to the hadith literature. This is still Sirah literature. We've got Sirah Maghazi happening here. Then we've got a few more. We have Ibn Sa'ad. We have a few others who happen. And then we get to the sources that Muslims consider the most reliable. Now, the most reliable source, according to Sunni Islam. Now, generally speaking, if someone says Muslim, they're referring to Sunni Muslims because 80% of Muslims around the world are Sunni. Unless someone puts a qualifier in Shia or some other denomination. Generally speaking, you're talking about Sunni beliefs. Now, 80% of Muslims believe then that a book called Sahih al-Bukhari is the most trustworthy source on Muhammad's life. Sahih al-Bukhari was collected by a man named Imam Bukhari, who wrote and died approximately 250 years after Muhammad's death. So now we're 250 years away. The next most trustworthy book is Sahih al-Muslim, written by a man named Imam Bukhari, and the two are not independent of one another. Imam Muslim was the student of Imam Bukhari, so they're not independent sources, but these are the two most reliable sources according to Muslims, Sunni Muslims. There's a lot more to this, by the way. There's hadith methodology. There's scholars who study the method of understanding hadith. They look at isnad, the train of transmission between Muhammad and the person who wrote these down, and they weigh the hadith as mutawatir or da'if or ahad, you know, the strength of the hadith. They'll say some traditions are reliable, some are not. Regardless, what we're left with is these two as the most reliable sources. Now, what do these sources say about Muhammad? I don't want to go too far in detail, because it can be offensive, it can sound like I'm trying to bash Islam. But I will tell you this, I'll tell you my conclusion, and if any of you are so bold as to ask the question over Q&A, I will answer it. Once you read Ibn Ishaq's Sirat Rasulullah, you do not walk away with the conclusion that this man is a prophet of God. Far from it, you see some tragedies that you would say are unconscionable. And again, I can answer those questions for you in the Q&A if you'd like. When you come to Sahih al-Bukhari and Sahih al-Muslim, same thing. I was raised believing that Islam was a religion of peace. That's why when 9/11 happened, it shook me to the core. I was just shocked when 9/11 happened. I said, how can people attack innocent human beings in the name of Allah, who is a peaceful God? That's how I was taught it. And when I started studying Islam with my own eyes, instead of with what people had taught me, I come to Sahih al-Bukhari, Sahih al-Muslim, Volume 1, Book 30. Volume 1 of Sahih al-Muslim, Hadith number 30. And what it says is, Muhammad said that I will drive all Jews and Christians out of the Arabian Peninsula. No, I'm sorry, that's Sahih al-Bukhari. Sahih al-Muslim is, I will leave none alive except Muslims. I didn't believe it was true. I said that must be a weak hadith, must be false. So I went to the next one, and the next one, and the next one, and they just kept piling on and on and on. All these hadith that made me think, this religion, I can't walk away from an objective perspective and say this man is a prophet of God. I can defend him as a Muslim. I can throw out these hadith and I can say, but Muhammad did it this in this context, and this happened in this context, and you can start defending him. You can take a defensive posture, that's fine. But as an objective investigator coming to the books of hadith and the books of seerah, the historical records of Islam, you do not walk away feeling like there's an objective case that Muhammad is a prophet of God. Far from it. You start seeing him as a product of the 7th century, a natural product of the 7th century. So then I turned to the Qur'an. And I said, where in the Qur'an can I find good reason to believe that the Qur'an is inspired by God? And there are 5 arguments that I found Muslims using most commonly, and I myself used some of these arguments, to show that the Qur'an is inspired of Allah. The first argument is the Qur'an's own argument. 5 times in the Qur'an, a challenge is issued, saying, if you think this book is a forgery, try to write another book like it. It doesn't matter if you call all your friends, it doesn't matter if you call jinn, which are kind of like demons, but not really. You call jinn and men alongside you and try to write something like the Qur'an, you will not be able to. That's the challenge the Qur'an gave 5 times. It's in fact the only defense. People used to come up to Muhammad and say, you are but a forger. This is recorded in the Qur'an. You are someone who's committing a forgery. You're just copying poems, or you're just saying poems. The Qur'an's challenge is, you try to recite something like this. You couldn't do it. Doesn't matter how you look at that argument, it has been answered. If you look at it methodologically, is it even an objective argument to say this is as good as that? It's too subjective in its methodology to be a real test. So it fails in its own methodology. It fails in the sense that it's trying to show something out of excellence means it's written by God. I'm not going to argue, like if I like, I don't know, if I like Kirk Cameron films, I'm not going to argue he's God because his acting is so good. I'm not going to argue that Eminem's rapping makes him divine. It's good stuff, sure, but that doesn't make him divine. So even the end point is not necessarily true. But what's more, the challenge has been met. There's a book called Al-Furqan. Al-Furqan al-Haq, I believe it's called, the True Furqan. And this is a book that was written in the past few decades, which attempts to copy Quranic style, try to write a book like it. It attempts to copy Quranic style, yet teach other doctrine. And so using Quranic orthography, using Quranic poetry and grammar, it tries to produce something like the Qur'an. This book has been recited in public places throughout the Islamic world, and Muslims regularly come up to those reciting it and saying thank you for having recited the Qur'an in public. That's how well it matches the challenge. In fact, India has found this such a devastating book that they have banned it from entry in its borders. So that the challenge has been answered methodologically in its endpoint, and also the challenge itself has been answered. It doesn't work. What's the second most common argument I see for the inspiration of the Qur'an? The second most common argument I see for the inspiration of the Qur'an is that there are scientific miracles found in the Qur'an. In other words, there's such advanced science found in the Qur'an that it could not have been written by a man who was just a man, who only had human knowledge. Either he had prophetic knowledge, thereby making Muhammad a prophet, or the Qur'an is inspired by Allah, and so you have the inspiration of the Qur'an. And the arguments that are used is, for example, the Qur'an has miraculous knowledge about the oceans. The Qur'an has miraculous knowledge about the atmosphere. The Qur'an has miraculous knowledge about X, Y, and Z. I believed this as a Muslim. In fact, there's a whole book published on this by a French physician named Maurice Bucaille, and it's called The Qur'an, the Bible and Science. And so I had that book as a Muslim, and I used to go through it, and I used to use the arguments. But by this point in my own investigation, I was in medical school, and I was able to study science, especially things like embryology, human development, in the Qur'an, knowing my knowledge from medical school, and testing to see whether or not they're true. And I'll give you one example. In the Qur'an, it says, it gives a process of embryological development. In fact, this is one of the most popular examples used by Muslims. It's found in Maurice Bucaille's book as well. And it gives this development process. And at one point in the process, it says that this embryo, it says this clot, this leech-like substance, is then developed by God into bones, and then it is clothed by flesh, and then it becomes something entirely new. And so it's pointing to this process of embryological development. Well, the problem is, ask anybody who studied embryology, that's not how it works. You don't get first bones, then flesh, then developed into something new. You have the same embryological layer, the mesoderm, that differentiates into both muscles and bones at the same time. And so it's wrong. It's not true. And so when you have clear statements in the Quran that are shown false, you can't point to obscure ones to try to say this is somehow scientifically miraculous. If the clear ones are false, why are you pointing to obscure ones to say it's true? And if you need something more clear, the Quran says, and forgive me if this is a bit crass, I don't believe it is, but it's in the Quran, and here's what it says. It says that the sperm, a man's sperm, comes from between his backbone and his ribs. No, it does not. It doesn't really take much of a degree in medicine to prove that, but I have one, and I assure you that's not where it comes from. So, how is it that this is defended? Well, Muslims will say you have to look at one of those words, it's a feminine, the other one's masculine, and so what it's saying is that, oh, when a woman and a man get together, no. Look, when the clear statements have to be reinterpreted in order to be shown to be scientifically true, then you're not coming objectively. You're coming with the bias. And someone who comes objectively to this is not going to conclude what you conclude. And so that argument isn't enough to convince an objective observer either. The third argument that I used, and this is the last of the three that I used, there's two others that other people used, was the argument from perfect preservation, that the Qur'an has never been changed, is the argument. And now this is something that runs deep in the Islamic veins, because as a Muslim, I believe that the Bible had been corrupted. All right, the New Testament's corrupt, the Old Testament corrupt, it's all corrupt. The only thing Allah has guarded is the discernment. According to Surah 15, verse 9, Allah has guarded the Qur'an. This one has been unchanged. It's perfect. Once again, when we study the early Islamic sources, we find that to be false. I'll give you a few ways to look into that. First, you can look into it through the manuscript evidence. We've seen portions of certain manuscripts that have been published, for example, portions of the Yemeni manuscripts, the Sana'a manuscripts, and we find differences between that and the modern Quran. That's not my main point. You see palimpsests, such as Fogg's palimpsest, which contains within it writings from what seems like Ibn Mas'ud's Quran. We'll talk about that in just a moment. But that's been washed out and a different text has been written over it. That's not my main point either. My main point is that you look at the earliest Islamic records and you see Muslims, not just random Muslims, but the Muslims who had been entrusted with the protection of the Quran, arguing with each other over what goes into it and what does not. Where do we start seeing this? Well, we start seeing it in Sahih al-Bukhari, Volume 6, Book 61. The entire book is a collection of how the Quran came together. In it, you see phrases like, well, I'll give you a key one first. A key one is Muhammad said, if you want to learn the Quran, go to these four men. The first person he mentions is Abdullah ibn Mas'ud, and then he mentions two other men, Salim and Muad, and the fourth one he mentions is Ubay ibn Ka'b. So if you want to go to the Quran, learn from these four. Two of them are Abdullah ibn Mas'ud and Ubay ibn Ka'b. Okay, so Muhammad picks them as teachers of the Quran. What else does Sahih Bukhari say? Same book of Sahih Bukhari, Volume 6, Book 61, says Ubay ibn Ka'b recites portions of the Quran that none of the rest of us recite. He's a teacher of the Quran. He recites portions of the Quran that none of the rest of us recite, and when asked not to, he says he will not leave it for anything whatsoever, because he heard it from the mouth of Muhammad. Surprising. Abdullah ibn Mas'ud, he's the first one Muhammad mentioned. You look at the records of what Abdullah ibn Mas'ud had in his Quran, he had 111 chapters of the Quran. Well, what does today's Quran have? 114. There's 3 chapters in today's Quran that were not included in the number one teacher Muhammad picked. What does Abdullah ibn Masud say about those 3 chapters? He says these are hadith Qudsi. These are revelations, sure, but they're not Qur'an. These are just prayers. What about the other guy, Ubay ibn Ka'b? What does he say? He says, Abdullah ibn Masud, you're wrong, and Uthman's Qur'an is wrong. It's 116 chapters. There's 2 more that should belong in here. These are the most trusted men with the teaching of the Qur'an, and they disagree with today's version of the Qur'an. The historical record points to this. The early Islamic records point to this. There's a lot more, by the way. Sahih al-Muslim actually says in hadith number 4434, I believe it is. No, I'm sorry, that's Sunan Abu Dawud. This is in Sahih al-Muslim, where it says that the reciters of Basra used to recite large sections of the Qur'an, but they forgot sections, out of which they remembered only this part. And they would recite portions out of large sections they had forgotten. Those are not found in the Qur'an today. Now, some people argue those have been abrogated. It doesn't work. For those of you who know the law of abrogation, this does not fit one of the 3 types of abrogation. It doesn't work. It's simply lost. So you have the early Muslims arguing over these things. You have records saying portions are lost. You cannot, once again, objectively conclude that the Qur'an has been perfectly preserved. Again, you can defend it. As a defensive position, sure, defend it all you want. And I'm not up here arguing that the theology has been changed. I'm not arguing that. I think the early Muslims did an excellent job of preserving their theology. I'm just talking about the verbatim preservation of the Qur'an. There's no good reason to believe that once you look at the earliest sources, unless you're coming at it from a defensive angle. The last 2 arguments that Muslims use to defend the Qur'an, I'm just going to mention them briefly. One is mathematical patterns. They'll say there's beautiful mathematical patterns in the Qur'an. And another one is that there are prophecies in the Qur'an. When you come right down to them, you look at those mathematical patterns, they don't add up. And when you come down to those prophecies, they're not prophetic. And we can talk about those under the Q&A time if you'd like. So, I'm going to end by saying this. As a Muslim then, I'm looking at these arguments. 3 that all need to be strongly evidenced in order for Christianity to be true, and they were. At the earliest historical records, using the strongest historical criteria. 2 arguments, either of which I needed to show in order for Islam to be true, and neither of them ended up being strong in the eyes of an objective observer. So what did I have to do? I had to make a choice. Do I follow the religion that I was raised with? Do I follow my family? Or do I dishonor them and pick something else? And for those of you who don't have a Middle Eastern or Eastern lineage, it might be hard to grasp just how difficult it is to take everything your parents have given you and throw it back in their faces, which is not what I was doing, but that's how they interpreted it. Very difficult process, so difficult that I didn't do it. I did not do it. I convinced myself that Islam was true anyway, until I couldn't bear it anymore, and I asked in prayer, Allah, and I would pray to Allah, and I'd say, Allah, who are you? Are you Jesus, or are you Allah, the God of Islam? And I asked for dreams, because that's what I was taught to do as a Muslim. I would pray istikhara, the salat that we would ask Allah to give us a dream, to tell us if something was true. So I asked God for dreams and visions. And He gave me a vision in 3 dreams, which pointed me to Christ. And I'm not here to talk about my testimony, I'm here to give you the evidence. But for those of you who are interested, this book comes out in February. You can read it there. So, in the end, I want to challenge you. No matter who you are in this room, if you're a Christian or if you're a Muslim, if you were raised by faith to believe something and you've believed it without challenging it, without testing it, I urge you, I challenge you to go talk to people who disagree with you. Let them challenge you. Study these matters for yourself. Because when the winds come and the foundation shakes, if you don't have strong answers to these questions, you're going to be left without grounding. And in that time, that extremely painful time, you better believe you need a God to hold on to. And not just any God, the true God who can bear you through. So whether you're Christian, whether you're Muslim, whether you're neither, find the truth. Search the truth. Don't have these questions ring around in your mind and not address them. A question under the surface left will fester like an infection. And even if you don't see it, it is destroying your flesh. It is destroying you to your bones. Air those doubts. Discuss them so that you can be solid, so that you can know with certainty. And pursue God, pursue truth by all means, because God is the most beautiful, unimaginably wonderful being in this universe. And if He created you, if He gave you everything you have, I would challenge you to say you owe it to Him. to find out who he is.